Welcome to part 3 of this tutorial on Excel VBA user forms. Now that we've dealt with designing and navigating through forms, we're finally ready to start adding code to it to make it do something useful. So as a brief summary of what we're going to cover here, we're going to give you a quick reminder of the forms code view and how to get into it. And to demonstrate the basics of writing code in forms, we're going to introduce you to a couple of the basic form events. We'll talk quite a bit about how you refer to the form and the various controls on it, so we can actually reference the values users have typed in. And then we'll talk about a few of the basic control events as well, to make the form actually respond to what users do. So it's a fairly short topic list, but there's quite a lot to talk about in each different section here. So let's get started. The starting point for this video then is the form that we finished creating in the previous video. So just to remind you of that, I'm going to click one of my 3 Show Form buttons, and that will display this basic data entry form we were creating. So currently, of course, the buttons don't do anything. That's the job of this video. So things we need to make work. When I click the Cancel button, I want the form to close down without doing anything else. When I click the Add to List button, I want the details that the user has typed in to be taken onto Sheet 1 and added to the next available blank row at the bottom of the list. That's going to involve the most complex part of code in this video. What we're going to actually start with to demonstrate the absolute basic principles is show you how to pre-populate some text boxes on the form when the form first loads. So that's going to involve referring to the different controls on the form and also learning about one of the basic form events. So to get started with that, I'm going to close down the form and then head back to the Visual Basic editor and make sure that my form is open and ready to be worked with. As it turns out, if I wanted to assign a default value to a text box on a form, I don't actually need to write any code to do this at all. As long as the value I want to enter is a constant, i.e. it doesn't need to be calculated, then I can just change the simple property of the text box in the Properties window. So for instance, for the gross dollars for the film's takings, what I can do is select the text box and go to the Properties window and scroll all the way to the bottom pretty much, and find the value property. If I wanted that to be set to 0 by default, I can just type in the value 0 and hit enter, and you'll see the 0 appears in the text box in the design view. So every time the form loads now, it will have that value in there by default. You may have also noticed that the text property of the text box changed as well. So the value and the text properties are linked. The difference is that the text property always returns its data as a string data type, and the value property can return, well, basically any data type. It's a variant essentially. So it could be a string, it could be a numeric type, or a date, for instance. When you've got, as I say, constant values, the value 0 doesn't need to be calculated. This is absolutely fine to do. But if it comes to something like the release date, let's say, for instance, I wanted the release date to be set to today's date, so it changed dynamically every time the form was loaded. I can't do that by simply setting the value or the text property. So what we're going to do is show you how you can modify this this value in code. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to change the value property back to an empty string or an empty value. So you'll see that if I remove that from value, it removes from text as well. And instead, we're going to add some code to the form's Initialize event to populate those text boxes automatically. Now you may remember from the first video in the series that there's a variety of ways to get to the code view of a form. One way would be to click on the form's background and then press the F7 key on the keyboard. Alternatively, I could look in the Project Explorer window and I can right-click on the form object there and choose to view its code. The simplest way by far, though, to view the code of the form is just to double-click on the background of the form, and you may well have done this accidentally previously. So I'm going to take that approach now. I'm going to double-click on the background of the form to get straight to the code view. You'll notice when you double-click on an object on the form, what happens is you're provided with a default event handler for that object. So the default event for a form is its click event, and I've been provided with the basic event handler procedure for when a user clicks on the background of the form. That's, of course, not the one that I want to use in this case. I'm interested in the Initialize event of the form. So when you find yourself in the code view, the key now to selecting the correct procedure is using the drop-down lists at the top left and the top right of the window. So at the top left, you'll get a drop-down list that gives you access to all of the different objects on the form. So you'll see if I click onto that drop-down arrow, I'll see a list of all the individual controls that sit on the form, as well as the form itself. When you've got an item selected, so I'll go back to selecting the user form, the top right drop-down list will give you a list of all that object's events. So as we can see, this one we're looking at the click event. If I click on the drop-down arrow, I'll see a list of all of the other events of the form. So there's quite a long list here. Quite a lot of things can happen in the life of a form. And bear in mind that every individual object on the form, every separate control, has a similarly sized list. We're going to look at the initialize event. So I'm going to select the initialize event from the drop-down list. Initialize is triggered whenever the form first loads into memory. So you can make anything happen here before the form appears on screen. If you want to do it at this stage as well, it's more than acceptable to delete any unused event handlers, so we can happily just delete our user form's click event handler. Should we need to bring it back later on, all we would need to do is select the click event from the drop-down list at the top, and that would regenerate it. So there's no harm in deleting event handlers if you're not going to use them for the time being. Just keep things a bit neat and tidy. So now all we have to do is add code to the event that will populate the text boxes on the form. And in order to do that, we'll need to learn how to reference the controls on the form, and there's a couple of different ways you can do that. Let's give myself a blank line and a tab space just to give my lay out my code a bit more neatly. The simplest way to refer to a control, I think, is to use the control's code name. So if you remember when you were designing your form, if I just double click on the form in the Project Explorer just to switch back to the object view, every control that you created, you hopefully gave a sensible name to. If you left these called textbox 1, textbox 2, textbox 3, this next stage is quite difficult. So having sensible descriptive names for each control makes life a lot easier. So to reference the control by its name, all I have to do, if I just double click back on the background of the form to go back to the code view, all I have to do is look in the IntelliSense list. If I press Control and Space on the keyboard and look for the control called Film Gross, I should find it fairly quickly and easily in the list. I don't even have to type in the rest of its name. Once it's selected in the list, I can just hit the Tab key to enter its name. All I then need to do is reference one of the properties of the control. So if I type in a full stop, I'll see a list of all the control's properties and methods, and the property that I'm interested in is the value property. You'll also find the text properties in here as well, by the way, so you can use either the text or the value property. I'm going to use the value because I'm trying to assign a number to this text box rather than a string. So I'm going to say filmgross.value and then simply make that equal to 0. Doing the same thing for the date is fairly straightforward as well. So again, I'm going to use the IntelliSense list. I don't have to do this. I don't have to press Control Space, but it makes sense to do so because it'll avoid mistyping the names of controls, and it'll means you have less typing to do in the first place, which is always good for lazy people like me. So again, I'm going to set the value of this to be equal to whatever today's date is. So I can do that by assigning the or using the date function to retrieve today's date. And that's one simplistic, fairly easy way to reference controls on a form. It's also worthwhile mentioning that every single control on a form belongs to the controls collection, and that gives you a couple of alternative ways to reference controls on the form. So rather than just using the code name, you could also refer to the controls collection by referring to controls, and then in a set of parentheses and some double quotes, you can enter the name of the control. So I can say film gross. So here we're passing in the name of the control as a string of text rather than as a direct reference to the object. So if I type in a full stop, sadly I don't see any IntelliSense here, which means you need to know what properties are available. So I can say .value equals 0. And likewise I could do the same thing for the film date. So I could say, once again, I could say controls, parentheses and quotes, film date, .value equals date. There genuinely is no benefit in terms of performance to either of these techniques. Really, the benefit is in when you're writing the code with the code names. You get the benefit of the IntelliSense, which is the technique that I tend to use. There are reasons and situations where this does become appropriate to pass in the name of a control as a string. I'm going to talk about one of those examples when we do the video on form validation, which should be the next one in the series, in fact. Finally, just while we're talking about the controls collection, just like most other collections in VBA, items in a collection are indexed. So that is, they're assigned a number which indicates the position of the item in the collection. So rather than referring to the controls by name, like so, I could also refer to controls by their number. Now, slightly unusually in VBA terms, in Excel VBA at least, the controls collection has a base of 0 for its index numbers rather than 1, which most other Excel VBA collections have. So to refer to the very first control on the form, I could type in a 0 and then say .value equals something. Of course, the massive problem I've got here is I've got no idea which control number 0 represents. So I certainly wouldn't use that example in this case unless I knew exactly which control was referred to by which index number. For this example though, I think I'm going to remove all these extra lines of code. The most sensible approach to take here is just to refer to a control by its code name, as we've already done. So that's the entirety of the procedure written. All we need to do now is test that it actually works. This is actually a fairly simple event to test. All we have to do is launch the form. So we can do that fairly easily by going back to Excel and then clicking any of the 3 show buttons that we added in last time, and we should see that immediately the form gets populated with a 0 in the film gross and the today's date in the release date text box. You'll probably notice, this is probably more obvious to people who don't live in the US, that we've got a US format for the dates, so we get a month, a day, year, rather than the one we use here in the UK, which is month, day, year. So if you wanted to modify the formatting of the date as it appears, maybe even use the regional settings of your machine, then we can achieve that in a couple of different ways. I'm going to go back and I'm going to close down the form to go back to the VB editor, and then we're going to go back to the event behind the form's initialize event, so I can just double click on the form again to go back there. The simplest thing to do here actually is just change which property we're using for the film date text box. We mentioned the idea that there's both a value and a text property. If I change the property that I'm using here from value to text instead, the text property will actually use the regional settings of the machine you're working on to format the date accordingly. So the value will actually be stored as a string inside the text box, but it can be converted easily back into a date value a bit later on. So having done this, if I then go back to Excel and I run the form again, we'll see this time it comes out as formatted in the regional settings of your machine. So nice and simple to achieve. If you wanted anything a bit more elaborate than that, then you can apply the format function to your date's value. So if I close down the form again, head back to the VB editor, go back to the form's initialize event. What I can do here is I can apply the format function to the value that I'm passing in. So I can say format the date and then type in a comma and then generate my own custom date format string. So I might say something like a single D, which will give me the number of the day of the month, then maybe 3 M's, which will give me the short code for the month name, so Jan, Feb, etc. And then another space and maybe 4 Y's, which will give me a 4-digit year. So having done that, close the double quotes, close the parentheses, give this one more quick test, head back into Excel, click on one of my buttons, and this time the date format comes out in the format I've selected. So the trick to this is making sure that when you refer to the value or the text stored in that text box, that it is treated as an official date. And as long as you've used one of the standard date formats, that will be the case. But we're going to come on to that a little bit later on anyway. So one more time, I'm going to close down the form, head back to the VB editor, and then head back to the code sitting behind the form. There's one more form event I'd like to look at just for the moment before we move on to individual control events, and that's essentially the opposite of the initialize event. It's the form's terminate event. So this is triggered when the form gets closed down and unloaded from memory. So if I go back to the initialize event, the drop-down list of events for the form, I can then scroll through the list until I find the terminate event. So if I select that, I'll get another event procedure listed alphabetically in the same code page. What I'd like to use this event for is to make sure that when the form closes down, the user gets taken back to the main menu worksheet. So what's going to happen when we get the form working properly, when we hit the Add to List button, that's going to take the user across to sheet 1. We'll rename that shortly. And then I want to make sure that when the form closes down, it automatically takes the user back to the main menu sheet. So back into the VB editor. To make this a little bit easier to achieve in terms of writing code, I'm going to give the menu sheet a sensible code name. So in the properties window, first of all, the project explorer, I'm going to select the sheet whose name is menu, and then in the properties window I'm going to change its name, so it's not called sheet 2, it's called WS menu. What I'm then going to do is go back to the form's code view, so I can double click on the background of the form to do that, and then in the terminate event, all I'm going to do is say WSMenu.select. Again, you can use Control and Space to show the IntelliSense or complete words if you like. So those are the two basic events of the form, when it first gets loaded into memory and then when it gets unloaded from memory. And this will work quite nicely as part of the full example. Okay, so now we can get on to actually making the buttons on our form work. So the first one I'd like to make work is if I show the form, I want to click the cancel button and simply make the form close down. That's fairly easy to achieve. If I go back to the Visual Basic Editor, what we can do here, simplest way to get to the code behind the cancel button is again just to double click on it, and that should take you back to the same code view, and it will generate the default event for the button. Fortunately, that's the one we wanted. It was the click event. If we needed a different event, then we've got the drop-down list towards the top right-hand corner, and we can select any other event from that list to get the correct event handler. This one's relatively simple and straightforward though. What we're going to do here in the cancel button's click event is simply tell the form to be unloaded. You may remember from the previous video, when we created the buttons to show the form on screen, we chose to load the form. If I go back to module 1 that I created in the previous video, I should find that I've got this load film details line. So we're going to do the opposite here basically. Back to the form and back to the click event of the cancel button. What we're going to do here, rather than load, is we're going to unload. So we're going to say unload, and then again we need to pass in a reference to an object. We can pass in the name of the form itself. As we did in the load method, we chose to refer to the actual form's code name. So I've got film details, that's the code name of the form. The interesting thing about referring to the form itself while your code is stored inside the form is that you don't actually need to refer to the form's full name. Instead, we could refer to the form using a short code name. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say unload, and the code name is called me, which is quite cute. Nice and short and easy to type and remember, I think. So me is a quick self-referential keyword. What me refers to is the object in which this code is stored. So this code here, this subroutine, this procedure is written inside the film details form. So me refers to that object. It's entirely up to you which of these two you want to use, but you only need one of them. So I'm going to comment out the first one, unload film details, and replace it with unload me, much shorter and easier to type. So now that we've done that, we've got a nice simple clickable cancel button. If I go back to Excel and I choose to load the form, I can simply click the cancel button now and the form will be unloaded. As the form gets unloaded from memory, it has to be removed from the view as well. So if I go back to the Visual Basic Editor, just as we did with the load event, we split it into two separate sections. We loaded the form into memory and then showed it on the screen. We could take the same approach when we close the form down. We can add code so that it hides the form first and then unloads it from memory, but that's not actually necessary because unloading will automatically remove it from the view. Should you really want to, you can say either film details .hide to remove it from the view, or even more efficiently, me.hide, and that will achieve the same result. Now the next job is to make the other button on the form work. So just switching back into Excel, if I click the Add to List button, I want the form to take the user to sheet 1, find the next available blank cell at the bottom of column B, and then whatever values I've typed into the form, I'd like to transfer into the appropriate cells. So to make all that work, what we're going to do is head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I want to attach code to the click of the Add to List button. So rather than going back to the form's design view or the object view, I can select the Add to List button from the drop-down list at the top of the code window, and that will generate again the default event handler for that object, which happens to be the click event, which is the one I want. So the absolute basics of making this work. Before we start referring to worksheets, I'm going to give sheet 1 a sensible name here as well. So I'm going to select sheet 1 and I'm going to call this one WS Films. And then I can write some code in the click event of the Add to List button that's going to say wsfilms.select. Then I want to find the bottom cell in column B. So I'm going to assume that there's already some data in column B already. So I'm going to go from range B2, which is the first populated cell, the one with the film's title in it. So I'm going to say range B2 dot. Then I'm going to use the end property to reference the cell that's at the bottom of the list in a downwards direction using XL down. Then I want to offset one further cell from there, so dot offset 1, 0 to go 1 row down and 0 columns to the right, and then say dot select as well. So that will leave me in the appropriate position now to start passing values into the cells in the next blank row. So at this point I'm going to refer to the active cell, and I'm going to say active cell.value equals, active cell, try that again, active cell.value equals, and then I want to refer to the value of the film name text box on the form. So again, I'm going to use the Control Space keyboard shortcut to display the IntelliSense, look for the film name text box, and refer to its value. The next line is going to put in the film's gross value into the cell that's one column to the right. So I'm going to refer to the active cell and say offset 0,1.value and make that equal to film gross .value. Then finally I'm going to say active cell.offset 0,2, so 2 columns to the right, .value equals film date .value. And that's the basic principle of what we're trying to achieve here. We don't need to do anything more to get the data transferred. So let's just see if that part works. So to test this, we're going to head back into Excel. Once again, head back to the menu sheet and click on one of our buttons to launch the form. And then just some basic details just to test that it's working. Last film I saw at the cinema, Deadpool, which I thought was great, I loved it. $731 million it's made apparently, according to Wikipedia, and its release date was the 12th of Feb 2016, again according to Wikipedia. So if I click the Add to List button now, I should find that those details get added in to the bottom of my list. It's not perfect because we don't apply the same formatting to the figures as the existing data has. The date format's changed ever so slightly here, you can see as well. It's put the dashes in, so it's picked that up from one of the standardized date formats in Excel, but that doesn't match the remaining values. We can always add more code to tweak that later on. What I'd also like to do is make sure that when the form has finished adding those details, it closes down the form automatically to take us back to the main menu sheet, because currently I have to do that manually. So I can do that either with the cross or clicking the cancel button. So let's head back to the VB editor and we'll add a little bit more code just to tweak this to make it look a little bit more professional. So back to the VB editor and back to the code behind the click event of the Add to List button. One approach we could take to solving the formatting issue is the same technique that we used earlier on. Use the format function to apply a specific format to the values in the text boxes. The small problem with that is that we'd then be hard coding the number format and the date format into the form itself. And if we decide to change the formatting on the worksheet, we'd have to come back to the code and change the formatting here too. So instead, what we're going to do is once we've added a value to the cell, we're going to change the number format property of the same cell so that it is matching that of one of the existing cells in the worksheet. So activeCell.0,1.value, beg pardon, not value, number format equals range C3.value. Number format, beg pardon. So that will change the number format of the new film to match that of the very first film that's in our list. We can use exactly the same technique to change the formatting of the film state as well. So we can say ActiveCell.offset 0,2 number format, make that equal to range D3 number format. So having done all that, if we give this one another quick test back into Excel, click on a Show Form button, I'll add the same film details in again, doesn't really matter, we're going to delete all these ones shortly anyway, so 731 million and then 12 Feb 2016. If we hit the Add to List button, or again I can hit the Enter key, or I can use my accelerator key, Alt and A, to click that button, I should find now that the formatting is essentially the same as existing data that's already in the list. So there we go, there's a formatting problem solved. The next thing I'd like to do is make sure that the form closes itself down automatically. So again, we're going to head back into the VB editor, and then we'll add a little bit more code to the Add to List button to make that part work. Making the form close down is pretty straightforward. We've actually already seen how to do that using the unload method and passing in a reference to the form. So we can just add that line of code to the bottom of this procedure. So unload me will close down the form once it's finished processing all the data. It might be nice as well just to pause briefly before that happens so that the user can see that the data has been added. So before we unload the form, we're going to add in a message box so that the user can actually see that the data has been added in the correct place. So we're going to say message box, and then I'm going to say, well, we'll refer to the film name.value, and then we're going to concatenate that with the phrase was added to row, and then finally we'll concatenate the row number of the cell that we're currently in. So I'm going to say active cell.row. Just to give that one a quick test, back into the VB editor, back into Excel from the VB editor, and we'll show our form on screen again. And again, I'm going to use the same details, Deadpool 731000000. Oops, too many zeros that time. And then 12 Feb 2016. And if we click Add to List again, this time we'll see that we get the same details, but we get a little message telling us that the data was added. If I click the OK button again, one last little tweak we're gonna make is to make sure that the form itself gets hidden from view when the code is running. So we're not going to unload it immediately, of course. That would mean we'd lose access to all of its values. But if I switch back into the Visual Basic editor, back to the Add to List button, just before any of this code is triggered, I want to make sure that the form gets hidden from view. So to make that work, I can say me.hide. Then all this code will work, being able to reference the values of the text boxes, and then right at the very end the form gets unloaded from memory and it will clear out all of the current contents. So one more time back into Excel, one more time to add Deadpool to the list, and we can refer to the same values, 731 million, 12 Feb 2016, and then finally, oh, I don't care that I've misspelled that, the formatting will get sorted out anyway. Click Add to List, and then there we go. So it's a little bit cleaner and tidier now that you can't see the form sitting around in the background. But again, clicking the OK button will close the form down, take us back to the menu sheet, ready to add in another one. So there we go. There's the basics of adding code to forms. We've seen the basics of getting access to the form events, we've seen the basics of click events of a button, and we've looked at how you can reference controls on a form as well. The next video is going to talk about how we can make this a little bit more robust. We're going to make sure that we can avoid users entering data where they haven't typed in numbers or haven't typed in dates, and we're going to make sure that they've filled in all the values that they should fill in as well by adding a bit of validation code to our form. So, hope you've enjoyed this one. Join us for the next one. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.